This lecture will briefly present the contributions of Robert Oxman, Rivka Oxman, and Neri Oxman to architecture, design, the arts, and science. The main body of the lecture will introduce the history and theory of modern architecture and postmodern architecture, which is the field of Robert Oxman. Robert Oxman is Professor and Dean Emeritus at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning, Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, where he is the Professor of the History and Theory of Architecture and Design. He has published numerous publications and books, many of them in collaboration with Rivka. Rivka is Professor of Architecture at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning, Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, where she is a Professor of Architecture and Design, Cognition and Computation. She is a Fellow of Design Research Society, Associate Editor of the Distinguished Design Research Journal, Design Studios, and has received an honorary doctoral degree, Doctora Honoris Causa, for her research achievements from the International University of Catalunya, Barcelona, in November 2017. Neri Oxman is professor at the Media Lab of MIT, where she is the founder of the Mediated Matter Group. She carries on experimental research in design potential and scientific impact of the digital fabrication of materials in order to develop new material behaviors and properties. Just two brief announcements. Please hold any questions until the professor has finished his presentation. And also turn off your cell phones. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. And basically it covers everything that I'm going to say. Basically, I'm going to speak about three people, two generations of one family that have been involved with architecture. And because it's architecture and few people here know very much about architecture, it's also our love for architecture. It's that kind of subject, actually, that you fall in love with very early in life, and you stay in love with it and forever, I think. And we try to return that love by the contributions that we believe that we made to it, and the love that we received that enabled us to work together, which is, I think, very, very unique, that the three of us have been able to work together. So the organization is very, very simple. It's the three people, Robert, Rivka, and Neri. And in the beginning, I'll just give a little personal background mainly to show the work that I did in the United States right after I finished graduate school. And there's one section in which I talk about our joint works. Otherwise, it goes quite simply. The most extensive part will be the second part, where I speak briefly. I try to introduce you to modern architecture and postmodern architecture. If there's any interest, we'll be able to do courses in the future. I don't know. I counted, I think, perhaps 85 lectures that I prepared, and they're sort of sitting and deteriorating in the computer. So, I was born in Malden, Massachusetts. At the age of approximately 4, I'm here with my elder sister on the left and my younger sister on the right. At the age of 4, my father died, and we moved to the West End, or the Wild West as I view it. It was a place of many, many opportunities for young people to work, to play. It was really wild, I think, in my memory, but I think it was a really supportive environment. After Boston Latin School, I was fortunate enough to be admitted to Harvard University, where I must say, still to this day, I remember the courses that I studied. It was just, as those people here who know or went to Ivy League schools, it was just an incredible intellectual environment, and just something deliriously wonderful. So much so, and I did rather well, So I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I was not in this building, but I chose this building because it says something very important about architecture, I think. The Graduate School of Design is aptly named because it deals with design. It has many subfields of design: landscape architecture, urban design, architecture, and urban planning. But this new building is built in such a way that the design laboratories, where the students actually work on the process of design, are supported by a foundation of academic subjects, which in fact are the knowledge basis of architecture. So I like the metaphor here of doing, sitting on studying somehow. So that's the process that we went through, and more or less you're going to see how it worked out in my case, because there's a lot of knowledge production in my case, and possibly very little design production, or relatively little design production, as it turned out by the facts of life, the way my life developed actually. The first building I worked on was with a firm called Cambridge 7 Associates. You all know them very well, despite possibly not knowing the buildings. This building is the New England Aquarium, which I suppose that many of you know quite well. But they also did the T. They also did all of the subways, the graphics of all the subway stations. The 7 people were 5 architects and 2 graphic designers. So it was a very unique office. And the building is one of the brutalist buildings in Boston, so-called brutalist buildings. They're rather brutal in fact, but it's taken from the French béton brut, crude concrete, as you will. The most difficult part in working on that building, if you know that building, was the giant tank in the center of the building. And the effort was to prevent the construction. You can view it on the various floors. You can just see the floor below slightly here. You can view it on the various floors, but the attempt was to make it transparent. So we pulled the floor away, and it was a very, very successful thing, I think. I also worked with Cambridge 7 on a magnificent building called, it was the American Pavilion at the 1967 World Fair in Montreal. I don't know if any of you happened to go to that. But there were 2 great buildings. There was Safdie's Habitat, the buildings that you remember, Safdie's Habitat, and this great building, which was, the dome was done by Buckminster Fuller, and Cambridge 7 did all of the interior design. Again, one of the nice things that I happened to do, actually I must say that I didn't do much of the design. A young designer working in a large office such as this is primarily working on construction documents, working documents. So you get the opportunity to work on the details in such a way that you can also be creative in the details. For example, I designed, among other things, the railing, and on the inside of the railing, you got all of the text for description of all of the elements on the pavilions. But it was a very, very, very dramatic pavilion where, in fact, you're just moving through the air. You separate the problem of shelter from the problem of content. And that's why it was a very brilliant building, and it's still standing today. I then moved to, after about 2 or 3 years, I moved to another office. It was just to gain the experience of another office. It was called Sasaki, Dawson & DeMay. I think it still exists in Watertown as Sasaki Associates. It's a building that was incredibly unique for being one of the first integrated practices in the United States. It was integrated with architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and urban design. 4 subjects working together to create projects, usually at very large scale. Here is we were working on the University of Virginia. We worked on the master plan. This is called the Lawns and Ranges. It was designed by the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, 1825. And Sasaki was became a campus planning firm. There was little actual architecture. There was some architecture done, but it was mainly working on huge campus plans. We did the campus plan, which attempted to do a very difficult thing, was to add buildings on the other side of the Jefferson's buildings. Another master plan that was tremendously interesting was the National Center for Atmospheric Research. At that time in the late 1960s, it was attempting to do what we now all enjoy, medium range weather projections, so that you could get a week's weather projection. This building was designed by I.M. Pei. They were in litigation with the architect at the time, so they had to take another architect. They were in litigation because the building was porous. You can see it's also a concrete building. It's, in this case, colored pink, and sits at the top of a hill, actually. And what we did eventually was not to touch his buildings, of course, was to build a corona for the hill that it was sitting on, so that there was a little stainless steel kind of expression of the base. I was the chief architect on this, for Sasaki on this project, this is a photograph from the internet, and it's about 50 years old now, and it looks its age. Perhaps it was, at that time, it was an elementary school for about 250 students. It was a very large and very interesting elementary school, because at that time we were experimenting with flexible training, flexible classes, so that within the class you could, why don't you come in? It's no problem. If you will, please come in. Within these groups of classes, you can move the partitions between exactly where the columns are located, here and here. You can move the partitions and open it into a class of 3 classes together. So all of the classes were flexible in that respect. After a number of years there, I wanted to do work in public housing. So I decided I would go to Israel, because I had heard that Israel was very, very famous for public housing, and it would provide me the opportunity not to work in an office where we were working essentially for very, very, very wealthy clients. So I went to Israel. This is Haifa, and this is where I landed. And I went to work in the Beerwald building, or the original Technion building. I'm sure that many of you here have seen that building. At that time, it was nuclear engineering in the basement and architecture on the upper floors, the main campus in Neve Sha'anan, and we worked there for many years, and I became, at that time, an academic. I was, at that time, encountering a situation where they didn't want professionals to teach in the architectural department. They wanted professional academics, and I took the challenge to do so while trying to maintain some kind of practice, actual practice in Israel. Today, they don't have that point of view. While I was there, I met a young lady called Rivka Edelman. She's sitting here. And it didn't take long. It took 2 years, actually, for me to convince her that I was going to make my way in Israel, which is not an easy thing. I didn't have much Hebrew. And it was very difficult to be an academic without learning Hebrew very quickly. I met her parents. Her father, on the left, Professor Joseph Edelman, was a structural engineer, and it is said that he walked from the Ukraine to get to the Holy Land. And he became probably the leading structural engineer in Israel. One of the first ones and one of the leading ones. Here, he started out at the Kibbutz Yagur. Here he is building buildings in Kibbutz Yagur. Miriam Edelman was from the family of Zimna Voda. They're still growing grapes. They started out as they were brought to Israel from Poland to grow grapes in order to make wine, and they're still growing grapes for wine in Zichron Yaakov. And that's us in 1974, after this big process of 2 years of convincing her that I would somehow survive in the Holy Land. And one of the products of that wonderful marriage was with 2 daughters. I have one daughter is an architect, although what she does doesn't really look like architecture. It deals mainly with materials. And the other daughter is an artist and graphic designer. So I'm going to speak basically about these three people, okay? And in the first lecture, excuse me, what I did when I became an academic, it was in the situation in the 1960s and early 70s. Actually, it was 1971. I was called upon to explain what was happening in architecture. Architecture in the mid-60s and 70s was changing its face tremendously. It was becoming a subject that had new kind of intellectual and philosophical content, and there was a revolution that because of the difficulties of the language that were associated with the huge quantity of reading that was involved, it needed someone actually to translate this for the students and the faculty. And that was the job that I received, and the challenge that I received when I came to Israel, to be an intermediary to the new language of architecture. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about modernism and postmodernism, what the differences are. And there are considerable differences. I show you what happened eventually was that I also became involved in the history of Israeli architecture. I'm going to show you in the beginning international architecture, and for modernism, postmodernism, I'll show you Israeli architecture as well. At least some wonderful examples of it. So modernism is rather difficult to date because it's very long. Usually it's from about 1850 to 1960 are the dates, but high modernism, where it really flourishes, is about 1890 to 1935. Why 1850? The new materials are making great, or cast iron primarily in Europe, is making great opportunities to build wonderful buildings, and the new style evolves from the new materials and the new structures. And the first building is about 1851, and it's an exhibition structure. You're going to see throughout this lecture that it is museums and exhibition structures that provide the field for experimentation. Perhaps the functional problems are less in the museum, and thus you can be much more flexible. Until today, you will see that it is the museums that have provided the opportunities for architects to experiment, if you will. What did, everybody knows this building, yes? Copley Square, yeah? Okay. In Copley Square, you can see you can see modernism, postmodernism, and pre-modernism, or neoclassical architecture in the 19th century. This is a neoclassical building, the Boston Public Library, by a very, very famous firm. It's 1903, by a very, very famous firm called McKimby & White, and all they did was to use the classical basis. This is modeled, I think, on a French library of the 19th century as well. And you can see it has typical classical elements, including the decorative elements around the windows, etc. Oh, excuse me. The decorative elements around the windows, if I do it right. Yeah. And the arches. And if you look in Copley Square and you stand in front of the library, you'll be able to see all of the different classes. There are 3 or 4 buildings there, including I.M. Pei's Tower, and you can see on the left, 500 Boylston Street, it's Philip Johnson's postmodernism. So in this area, you can really get everything encapsulated. I tried to put down 7 points of what modern architecture tried to do. First of all, we've all already seen the first one. It tried to get away from classicism. It tried to make a new approach and a new style that would be not dependent on copying the classical style. The classical style had almost been since the days of Rome and Greece. The classical style had almost been continuously dominant. So the first thing that it tried to do was anti-classicism. The second thing that it tried to do was make a new spatial conception. To think of space in a different way. To think of space as the content of design. So space should be continuous. It should not be closed off by the exterior walls. Somehow the window should be bigger, or it should be all glass. Technology and the new materials were really very, very important things. And for example, the invention of the elevator almost changed the world. Excuse me if I borrow some Hebrew occasionally. Almost changed the world. Structure was not hidden any longer. It was to be expressed. Form was going to attempt to achieve geometrical purity and as close as possible to answering the needs of function. Form follows function became the Bible. That's what architects tried to achieve. And it was less difficult in certain building types like the museum. In housing, it's very, very difficult. Function, new forms for new functions. Theory, there was a new body of theory that was developed just for modern architecture. And obviously, knowledge, there were new schools that were developed in order to, who kind of led the way. And one of them that's significant, or perhaps the most significant, is the Bauhaus, despite the fact that the Bauhaus, when it began in its first generation, was not an architectural school. But they brought the best people from the arts and from the crafts to that building, and it was a revolutionary building. Here you can see, obviously, the glass face of the Bauhaus building. And all of some of these beautiful elements of the chess sets, etc. Everything that was designed in the the Bauhaus attempted to push and expand the horizons of modernism. The leader of the first phase of this was Walter Gropius, and here you see the still existing and still used student dormitories in that building, and it became and still is very, very successful from 1919. His new buildings there in Weimar. The first years were in Weimar. This is in Dessau. He was there until 32, and then in 19, I believe, a little after he started these buildings, they began to include also teaching in architecture. Le Corbusier, another great figure of modern architecture, in 1914 came up with a scheme that he promoted as a basic scheme for architecture. He called it Maison Domino, or the Domino House. And I show it to you only because it is really a key to the expression of modern architecture. First of all, it's simple geometrically, but much more important, you can see that. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. You can see that the columns are withdrawn from the facade. The columns are withdrawn from the facade. This means that the facade of the building is free. It's not dependent on any walls, and it's not dependent on showing the structure. If you move the structure to the edge of the slab, then you can't get rid of it. You always see the structure. So this is a very, very interesting idea, and it made modern architecture very free with respect to expression. It's a very key understanding. The section that I showed you in the beginning and this are two very important points to understand. They teach you what it took me a long time to learn. Le Corbusier, the author of that previous sketch model, did a famous villa named Villa Savoie, and in 1931. And here you can see modernism at its finest expression. First of all, it's very pure. This is something that later is going to be a pain in the neck for future architects. And postmodernism is trying to reduce this necessity to be pure geometrically and to be pure in the way that materials are incorporated, etc. But at this point, you have the points of modern architecture, the pilotis. You're going to see it in Israel in the 1930s as well. The pilotis, or the columns protruding from the bottom, the free elevation, the horizontal strip window, the use of the roof garden, etc. These become the Bible of modern architecture. And exactly 1958, Mies van der Rohe, a German architect who in the 30s took over the Bauhaus, builds the Seagram building. Still, I believe, one of the great high skyscrapers in New York. It was a pure skyscraper, but you're looking at a building in which exactly what Corbu showed in the little model exists here. You see the columns are withdrawn from the exterior, and what is called a curtain wall, it is a wall that operates like a curtain, does not depend on the structure except to tie itself to the floor slabs. It's completely free. It's rather frightening. It's why the windows fell, I suppose, in John Hancock's building. But it is really a beautiful and pure kind of bronze-colored aluminum, wonderful to see. It's hard to not show the work of the genius, the American genius, Frank Lloyd Wright. I show his last major building, but the story of modernism is obviously much more complicated than what I've tried to introduce and much more extensive, but these mainly are among the major architects: Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Gropius, really in the end not such a great architect. Exactly when I went to, by the way, when I went to Harvard Graduate School of Design, I used to go to the restaurant, and who would I meet there but Walter Gropius, who became a professor and the head of the Department of Architecture at Harvard. In the 1930s, there's an immigration into what was then Palestine by people who are Europeans, who are in flight from what's happening in Europe, and they bring with them all of the knowledge of modernism. Tel Aviv, 1909, you know, the foundation of Tel Aviv is in 1909, so it's constructed almost on the basis of all of the principles of modern architecture, bringing hot off the grill, having been brought right off the grill from all of the best schools in Europe. Consequently, both the urbanism of Tel Aviv and the architecture of Tel Aviv, which we'll see in the next slide, are done by people who have brought, as I say, the background of modern architecture in its finest expression. The other thing that's very interesting here is it's done by a woman. Not only, something was fostered at the Bauhaus, that despite the fact that architecture tends to be a masculine profession, the Bauhaus mixed males and females in a wonderful way. And to Israel, there came a lot of brilliant women. I now have a PhD student who's finished her PhD, who's written a book on women in Israeli architecture. Really a marvelous phenomenon. And this is Jenny Averbach, 1934. She did several other buildings in Tel Aviv, and she did this is Dizengoff Circle. I don't know if you have been to Tel Aviv. The major street in Tel Aviv is Dizengoff Street. It used to be the major street. And of course, they brought architecture. And there are 3,000 modernist buildings in Tel Aviv that look like this. 3,000 of them. These are among the most beautiful, I think. There are apartment houses on the left. They're both done by Zeev Rechter. A very famous one is Engelhaus on the left, and it's pure Corbusier. It has the strip windows. It has the building lifted up on columns, or pilotis, as they're called in architecture, pilotis. He studied in France, by the way, and these are two of his beautiful buildings. The horizontal line and the simple geometries are characteristic of modern architecture. And there you see it in such a beautiful way. It's such a really gorgeous building. It's almost spiritual. For me, it's almost spiritual, because you feel the purity of the building, the horizontality that wants to keep moving. The Dutch would make it keep moving. The Dutch would do it with planes, and they would make it keep moving, and it would be slightly different. But you can feel that continuity of pieces in the building, I think. Very, very successful. That was done by the second generation. That's Jacob Richter, Zeev Richter's son. And here, it's 1968. It's in Zichron Yaakov. Today, it's a very famous hotel in Israel. It's called the Elma Hotel and Cultural Center. It has a museum connected with this building, which was a sanatorium. It was for the sanatorium for the workers' organization. Miftachim, it was called. Things get tough in the 60s when that building was done. They were moving away from the geometry, they were moving away from the feeling that, first of all, it's after the war. The first years of after the war were tremendously involved with reconstruction, with just pure building. So it offered opportunities to change, but still modernism continued. Modernism still continues, as a matter of fact. But there started to be a push for the possibility of expressing buildings in a different way. Very simply, creative architects wanted to do it differently, so they moved away from modernism. And Le Corbusier did a church in 1955 that moves away from the geometry totally. It quotes, if you will, the architecture, Greek island architecture, which he was very fond of. It plays with the organization. It doesn't use the grill for the organization of the windows. If we move to the inside, you can see how free he is with organizing the windows in an artful way, in a complex way. So even one of the great masters feels the need to loosen up a bit, to change the way we look at architecture and to make it free. But there were other things that were happening at the same time, and one of them was this book on the left, 1966, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, done by a man named Robert Venturi, later became a professor. He wrote both of these books. Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture simply states that architecture was never pure. It was always open to influences. Influences of the context, influences of the materials, etc. And you could not come with one perfect style. So postmodernism tried to free things up. And it, by the way, became a cultural phenomenon. Postmodernism was not only in architecture, but it was in literature. Postmodern literature, very, very famous, I think. And many other fields were transformed in the 1960s. The 1960s, not only the Beatles, but it was a great intellectual production during the period of the 1960s. Learning from Las Vegas tries to take the theoretical part of this little book for a moment and turn it into practice by coming up with an idea that he calls the decorated shed. The decorated shed. What does that mean? You could take a very, very simple building and be free on the outside. You could make a functional building, but you could decorate the outside any way you wanted to do, any way you wanted to do it. And how did he do it? How did he do it? He took his mother's house as an experimental building. It's a very simple wooden building, but you see, he's trying to do certain things that maybe for an architect are easy to recognize, but I think in general it doesn't look revolutionary. But in fact, it was for architects a very, very revolutionary and problematical building. It had the perfectly square door, the roof, instead of a flat roof, it takes a roof of this shape and has a cut in it to provide a little balcony. And the cut comes just at the point of the keystone, if it were an arch. And the real arch exists, but it doesn't have any material. It's a dematerialized arch. It's a very funny building. I'm describing it seriously, I think, because of the theoretical content of the building more than really the physical importance of the building. But you can see he brings the motif of the wainscoting. That's a 19th century motif in buildings in which they treated the base as something that's exposed to kicks, etc., and used one kind of material and the upper part as another kind of material. So he took a very, very simple building with a very, very simple plan and a very small building and tried to put all of the ideas of a new architecture, all of the ideas of getting away from the pure and getting to something that could be less than pure. Hans Scharoun, this is the Berlin Philharmonic. Has anyone ever heard music in the Berlin Philharmonic? No, it's a beautiful building, and really I strongly recommend it. Hans Scharoun was one of the foundation modernists. He had all of the background of simple square buildings. And in 1963, all of a sudden, he produces a building that has gold aluminum on the outside, that has very irregular and sculptural shapes, that has a funny kind of sculptural roof, etc. But in addition to the new geometries and perhaps a new kind of material, normally this kind of building in Germany is treated in a very somber way. The inside is made of platforms called terraces, and the whole organization is quite irregular and formed around the musicians who are sitting in the center of the. It's hard to see it from this, but these are the musicians down in the center, and all of these things are little terraces sitting around it. So it's very, very irregular and sculptural on the inside, and it was quite revolutionary, despite the fact that I don't think he was trying to make a revolution. We know what's happening in the late 1960s and early 70s. Technology and the technological expression becomes something that really departs from the pure white architecture of modernism. This building, Centre Pompidou, everybody knows Centre Pompidou, no? Another, no, you don't know? Paris, middle of Paris, great museum. Centre Pompidou was a completely flexible museum. The floors have no construction on them. All the construction is at the outside of the building. It is totally flexible, and all of the circulation is on one side, and the mechanical organization is on the other side. It's kind of a miracle of thinking, but really, I believe, kind of a shock when you see it in the center of Paris. Like the Parisians were really shocked by it when it happened. But it's a big change. On the left is Charles James. Nobody read about Charles James. He died last week. He was in my class. He was my friend and classmate. But he wrote a book called The Language of Postmodern Architecture. It's gone through, I think, 15 editions. A really famous book that wrote the rules of postmodernism as a critical form of architecture, as a critical approach to architecture. And he turned architecture into an intellectual profession, which is no small achievement, I think, because normally it was a kind of tough, get into the field, no women kind of profession. And he changed it almost single-handedly into an intellectual profession. And he wrote, this guy who did English in his first degree at Harvard, wrote 30 books on architecture, some of them truly miraculous. But because he tried to promote historicism, and postmodern architecture started with historicism in the beginning, changing materials, but also historicism, well, lots of people are sleeping. I should speak quietly. There were, I hope it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to me. It comes from the heart. There were tremendously shocking buildings that were built in New Orleans on the right, one of the most famous and one of the most shocking. To see what is postmodernism and what it did to modernism, it's called Piazza d'Italia. It's obviously an urban space, a large urban development in New Orleans, basically for the Italian population of New Orleans, which apparently is large. And you can see instead of using stone, he's using kind of plaster. Instead of using normal materials, he's introducing neon lights. Instead of using stone capitals for the classical columns, he's using stainless steel. So he's really, as a matter of fact, even the colored base in a different color of marble at the bottom of the thing. It's a very large project, but this kind of treatment of postmodernism in a kind of jocular way for an urban development would in Europe be totally impossible. I think even here it was ridiculed and considered very problematical, but it was just what architects were doing in that period of time. They were trying to say, we're going to make changes, we're going to be revolutionary. Normally architects do what the client says, but occasionally they have an opportunity to get a client that allows them to experiment. And when they can experiment, sometimes shocking things happen, but they're always interesting intellectually, I believe. Architecture has become an intellectual profession. So in the 1980s, he becomes rather ridiculed for writing this philosophy, and he becomes a landscape architect. He changes his, well, he's mainly a writer and a theoretician, but he departs from doing buildings. His buildings were quite interesting, but rather problematical also. And his landscape is problematical. He does many gigantic landscapes.
Where is that?
That's in Scotland. I'll tell you the story afterwards, and obviously, the person who's considered the greatest living architect today is Frank Gehry, who almost builds his uniqueness as an architect on anti-classicism. They move away, it's given a name, I said everything, it's given a name in architecture called deconstructivism, because deconstruction is a very important philosophical movement at the time. So deconstructivism, very interesting in the sense that what it does is uses unique approaches to the development of architecture that are very, very powerful in their spatial treatment. They're very angular usually. They're non-rectilinear. In this case, they're also using unique kinds of materials that are not used in architecture very frequently, such as corrugated iron and chain link fences. I'm sorry I didn't describe the project, but it should be obvious that this part is being added to a small wood frame house. He bought a wood frame house. He expanded the wood frame house by wrapping it in unusual materials, if you will. Materials that, and you can see how he treats it. They're the attempt to treat the building as a sculptural and intellectual entity rather than to provide a good finish. There's no finish, it's plywood that's exposed. So obviously he's trying to develop something that's unique at that time. And he really succeeds in doing it. Right at that time, there's another book comes out that's very significant book. It's done by Philip Johnson. It's called Deconstructivist Architecture, 1988, which takes a small group of people, Frank Gehry being one of them, and has a major exhibition of this new approach to postmodernism. So what I said is it starts by being iconoclastic. It starts by using new approaches to spatial design. It's not rectangular, usually. It's quite angular in nature. And so the famous building that so-called The Miracle of Bilbao, another museum, by the way, the Bilbao Museum. It's not stainless steel, it's titanium. Who knows titanium if you're not doing an airplane? You don't know much about titanium. In fact, this man who works as a sculptor on most of his buildings uses and promotes computer-aided design. He's one of the leaders, Gary Systems it's called, one of the leaders in computer-aided design until today. And they did it on the basis of a system called CATIA, which was a French system that was used to make airplanes. So in order to produce these buildings, you had to have computer-aided design. You could never do this kind of thing except by doing it with, they say Frank Gehry makes paper designs out of cardboard. You could only do it with cardboard. You could never do it without having computer-aided design. So computer-aided designers in the background of this revolution is making another kind of revolution for architecture. In the background, this horse is running. I better move on fast so you can see the complexity and the spatial complexity. This gorgeous, actually a gorgeous building, 2002, where the architect Cecil Belmont is a great architect with a fantastic firm called Arup, working with a Japanese architecture called Toyo Ito. And if you all go to London frequently in the summer, then you know that in Hyde Park there's summer museums put out called the Serpentine Gallery. There's this gallery called the Serpentine Gallery, and they have a summer pavilion. Every summer they invite a new architect to do the pavilion. So this is one of the early ones. It gives architects an opportunity to do experimental architecture. And quite late here, 2004, 1994, you can see how this approach to angular architecture, to very complicated architecture, to newer spatial conception than modernism is happening. On the left, a museum-based 3 pavilions. One characteristic of postmodern architecture is there is a tendency to do it with various modules. Yes, you're building instead of one box. You're building with separate modules. Here, the building, it's in Groningen, which is in northern Holland. Here, the building is done by 3 different architects. So the yellow, the white, and this very colorful, broken up box on the right-hand side. If you will, willful postmodernism, not necessarily functional postmodernism at all. And I compare it with the one on the right, probably the current genius of architecture until today is a Dutchman by the name of Rem Koolhaas. His office is called Office for Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA, and this is a Seattle Public Library. It's very interesting because the program is written on the left, and you can see it's a series of pavilions in the air. The lines of structure connect those pavilions. So here the complexity is joining between the sophistication is too much for me. The major parts of the library are closed, and then the open parts of the library that enjoy the view as well as reading, etc., connected by the lines of the facade. So now I go back and just show you the facade for a minute. That's a rather beautiful building, despite the fact that it's very complex geometrically. At this point, this is one of the deconstructivists, by the way. I don't think the project is does anybody go to Berlin? This is in the center of Berlin. It's the monument to 6 million. Here's a better view of it, perhaps. And in Israel in 2005, Moshe Safdie, the same year, is producing the Yad Vashem that I'm sure all of you have seen or heard of. I'm more or less just finished this with one Israeli postmodern building. You wouldn't think that this would be the function for a postmodern building. It's the Israel Supreme Court. Has anybody seen this building? No? It's really an incredible building. I think you can see it better. I showed this slide because here you can see that's the Knesset, okay? Jerusalem Hills, the Knesset, and this beautiful building, stone building. Here you see it in the snow, so it's a great, not only can you see the different organization of the building, but it's a really fantastic photograph of the building in the snow. So what do we have? Obviously, it's not the usual courthouse. The courthouse is one of the most, let's say, serious of monumental buildings everywhere in the world. In this building, suddenly, it's kind of floppy. It's opened its wings to the environment, really. And what you have here is basically, those of you who have seen it, it almost has no entrance. Whereas it should have a monumental entrance, it has no entrance. The counter logic of postmodernism is one of the things that's interesting. It makes you contemplate, I believe, about how the building is put together, but very, very briefly, because I see that maybe here I'm getting along to the end. Well, I'm going to have to do this quickly. The parts of the building are, the entrance is on the side, you come through this main block. These are the major courtrooms. This courtyard is here. Just I'll show you in a minute these pieces. This is the courtyard. It's completely classical. The courtyard is completely classical. You see there are funny distortions. If your eye has now become able to understand how this work is taking place, you have unexpected sizes. And they're always playing with the keystone for some reason. The keystones are being large. The window is expanding in a strange way. So there are always special kinds of artistic treatments in postmodern buildings. This is the entrance to the courtrooms, the courtroom wing. It's very beautiful, I think. Just the way the light comes in. This is the other side. I show it to you because you can see, whoa. You can see the complexity of the way he treats the door in several layers, and the interior. You can look at how he's treating the columns. In this building, in fact, all of the historical references are supposed to be references from ancient Israel. And they tell you, you can get a book that tells you exactly where they took the details from. But, oh, here they're doing brass instead of stone, etc. But they do it in a very, very, very tasteful and beautiful way, I think. So, just quickly, I have two more pieces. One is a bit about Rivka's work, which is about design cognition. Remember the drawing, the photograph of Harvard Graduate School of Design. Design is sitting on top of architecture. Design is what you do to make architecture come into being. And in the 1980s, Rivka, who's sitting there also sleeping, Rivka in the 1980s did a PhD in Australia with one of the leading people in design cognition, the emergence of this idea called design cognition. And it used AI in order, AI, if anybody here knows very much about about artificial intelligence, the first move or growth of AI was in the 1980s. In the 90s, it went down, and now, in a gigantic way, it's driving your car. But her thesis, PhD thesis, was one of the first architectural attempts to use AI, and it even used Prolog, which was an AI computer language. So she very early tried to get involved with design cognition and design computation, and I'll just show you very quickly four examples of her work. One of the problems of thinking about design is that in an architectural school, they teach you about architectural history, but they don't teach you how to do design. Nobody teaches you how to do design. So in the late 90s, people began to think about what was design cognition. What does design cognition mean? It means how do you think about design? So for the first time, people were beginning to write on, to experiment with, to do empirical studies of how designers were designing, just by asking architects how they did it, or giving them tests to do. So for example, in this case, you can see this is the attempt to achieve some understanding of what typological design, how do you design using types. In architecture today, it's become very, very important. How do you think using typological content enables you to come up with what are called variations. So typology, the type and variance is a very significant way of designing. And she did an experimentation with designing chairs, and they came up with the photographs around the edge are actual chairs, and these are kind of schema. The schema is the relationship between the master form, developing into a subform, developing into variant forms, etc. And some of these chairs that look very, very strange actually exist. This is another drawing. The basic idea was to research what the thinking of related to schema and type was into design. Another work that she did was involving morphogenesis, or how natural design, how nature designs. You're going to see this a lot in the way that my daughter works. This is one of the important things about her work. How nature designs, and how does the way in which this is a section of a tree, and you can see that some event in the history of the growth of that tree had produced this kind of thing. So there is a pattern of morphogenesis that exists in nature, and how can this help us to understand how design might work as, for example, biology, bone structure on the left, and design on the right. How can these two things begin to come together? Those were part of her research works. A third one, morphogenic genetic design. She also studied how architects use experimental designs. This was the great German engineer, architect Frei Otto, and what it turned into. It was designed on the basis of the model. She showed you the model because she went to the University of Stuttgart, where they still have this research laboratory, and they only work with models. How can designers work with models? Because he was really a master of working with models like this in order to design fantastic lightweight structures. It was called ILS, the Institute for Lightweight Structures. And this is, I don't remember, one of the Olympics in Munich. And then she came up with a series of computational schema or a diagrammatic approach to the way design takes place, with the designer in the center. He represents, he generates, he studies performance, and he evaluates. Going through this process in various ways, and using students and professional designers, she came up with a series of design based upon the conventional method of sketch design and performance-based design, so-called. And so in 2017, for her research, she received a, November 2017, just 24 months from today, she received a doctor honoris causa from Barcelona, from a great architectural school in Barcelona, which is super unique. I don't think that there are many at the Technion. There's no one in our faculty. And at this university, the first woman and the first architect to receive that distinction. So the work was around the world. This, just fast, some of our books. We did 9 books together. And a little view of something that we designed. It's a courtyard house. It's an L-shaped house around the courtyard. And this is the view of the entrance. It's stone and stucco together. And just quickly, the entrance, the courtyard. It's got this long bench running the full length of the courtyard. I was very interested in minimalism in design, another sub-form of postmodernism, minimalism. I still love it. This is the interior. It's got a thick wall because there are metal shutters that protect the whole house. So the shutters go up into this little boxes. They go into the thickness of the wall. Really great house. All of the same, you see it's the same stone on the floor as on the wall, but it's just treated differently. It has a beautiful swimming pool and garden. The windows are closed because they're cleaning the house. 5 minutes for Neri Oxman? 5 minutes. We went over, wow.
Beautiful.
First of all, she's beautiful. But her works are as beautiful as she is. So it's just she has a group called Mediated Matter. Very simply, it means how can digital fabrication change the potential behavior of materials? That's all it means. Mediated matter, but it's very, very complex because you have lots of digital media, like 3D printers that can create various kinds of things. So the video is called Then and Now. It shows she's only been working for 9 years. It shows some of the things that she's done as a student, and then is as a student, and now is now. So let's see if we can get them.
Every weirdo in the world is on my wavelength. It's a Thomas Pynchon quote, but it so well reflects what I felt when I entered the cube in E15 during the fall of 2006. It was late at night. There was a group of us trying to make sense of Mass 863.
So here she's a student.
What we came to
The course is
realize
called How to
was that
Make
we were about
Almost
to embark
Anything.
on a journey.
I
It wasn't
can't, I
just
don't
a
know.
class. It was a world.
This is as loud as the computer, though. I don't.
Thinking about making. And it was also about kindness, about making up for each other's lost math or found physics, learning how to knit while typing differential equations in Word. I got to teach the prep cycle, and in return I learned how to draw a circuit diagram. Eagle took over Rhino, and I started wearing flats. Except for in the cube where we were passionately overworked, barefoot and sleepless for an entire semester. Like lab hippies. Only we were actually making stuff work. Everything we needed was there on the HTML island. And if you couldn't make what you wanted, you probably didn't need it.
Very,
My
very
first
famous
commission
course.
for MoMA came out of How to Make Almost Anything. I was working on flexible composite structures, integrating structure and skin into a continuous wall tiling system. It was designed to accommodate a range of mechanical, optical, and environmental conditions, such as structural support, light transmission, and heat flux. The project was called Cartesian Wax, and we spent the better part of 2006 working on it, like now. Everything I learned from Neil, from Sherry, Amy, Yvonne, and the entire CBA team, that
Seen
and
Lamont and all.
lots of love and dedication went into that project. The shop in Neil's lab was our coral island by night. By day, we would catch up on food and sleep. If there was ever a class that entirely transformed the way I how I make, it was how to make almost
how I
anything.
made.
Thank you, Neil.
This
Thank
is
you,
now.
CPA, and a big hug to all of you at Fab 11.
Material ecology deals with the aspect of learning from nature as well in this process of working with materials. We made a pavilion done by, woven by silkworms. Glass printer. That's the next generation. That's the third generation. Thank you very much. Sure, please.
I'm going to open this up for questions now. Anything to ask the professor?
Please. Put it on, but he was Coleman and McKenna were my teachers in the third year. It is based upon a building of Le Corbusier, so all architects recognize it and really appreciate it very much. It was, by the way, an international competition. They won it as an international competition, Bostonians, and the first 2 or 3 prizes were brilliant buildings, I think. This was also a brilliant building. I know that it is because of its scale and because of the kind of dominance of the béton brut, the raw concrete. It's very despised, I think, by the public. But you see, Boston, in that area, particularly, because there's another building that's even more difficult, really, and that's the sociology, the social services building of Paul Rudolph, the one with the concrete that's broken, where they built it with the ribs.
Faneuil Hall?
No, between Faneuil Hall and the City Hall, there's another building. It's a tower, and it has some smaller buildings around it. That's all made from ribbed, what's called ribbed concrete. The concrete is built with ribs in the form so that it comes up with points, and then they break the points. It's very gross concrete.
Cambridge Street, right on Cambridge.
Yes, it is, right on Cambridge Street. It's right in the... I think that for architects at that time, it was attempting to accommodate innovations in concrete. The City Hall is not considered an innovative building, but it's considered very, very beautifully done by architects. I think that in the test of time has been such that it's been tough to live with, mainly the proportions of concrete elements are just overwhelming. So I don't know. It's a problematic building. I still believe that they were great architects. I still do. But I understand the difficulty that people have from living with comfort, raw comfort. And Boston, because there are so many fine architects in Boston, Boston has lots of big time has lots. In fact, there's a book about just about big time in Boston. So I still like it. So.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Okay, let me walk up to you.
Yes.
Okay, 1 second.
Can you tell us who's living in the house in Israel?
Who is that
Who is living in the house in Israel that you showed
right now?
toward the end?
No, my books, my library.
Was that your house?
Pardon?
Was that your house?
That's my house, yes, I showed you my house.
That was your house that you showed us?
Yes.
Oh.
Cesaria?
It was great.
Anybody else?
I can say, you know, it's a really gorgeous profession, I think. If you want to advise your grandchildren of something fantastic to do, but it's a difficult way of living. Really. My mom said to me, it's a rich man's profession. I still remember that. And basically it is. Charles Jenks was married to Maggie Keswick. I didn't have time to mention all of this. Maggie Keswick is from the Keswick family of Scotland that owns the Jardine Bank in Hong Kong. And she had a few dollars, so he did wonderful experimental stuff, I think. So, but also they did they did Maggie Centers. Has anyone ever heard of Maggie Centers? Maggie Centers, yes.
What materials?
I'll say Maggie Centers. Maggie Centers are
Use the mic.
havens.
Use the mic.
Maggie Centers are havens for cancer patients. So at various hospitals throughout the world, but mainly in Great Britain, there are, I think, 30 Maggie Centers that something like that, 27 Maggie Centers. Each one has been done by a great contemporary architect, gratis, beautiful places to kind of recover yourself after you've been through some kind of experience in a hospital.
What materials are used in the interior design to mimic nature design?
That's an interesting question. Mainly they're in form, but I would say wood probably. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, are they plastic, liquids? How do they get the shape?
Some of them are. One of the projects that was shown in the videos that dissolves are made of natural materials that are I think they're called melamine. I think it's melamine. They're working on natural materials, and that group, which is called Material Ecology, they're working only with natural materials that can be easily recycled, and that's why they showed a structure that was created, a small structure, you could see it being printed on a table, that's created that by dipping it or returning it to water, it's made basically from shells, lobster shells, etc. I've forgotten the class of shells that they use, but they are experimenting with natural materials.
We've all, probably, a lot of us have seen the Sydney Opera House. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Sydney Opera House is now, let's say,
Mike,
1950s now.
You have to use your mic.
You got it, they can't hear you.
Oh, the Sydney Opera House Rivka did her thesis in Sydney, Australia. And because there happened to be a world expert at the University of Sydney in what she was looking at. So we had the opportunity actually to see the Sydney Opera House. Otherwise, it's a long way to go to see a building. But It was done by, I don't know how much you know about it, it was done by, also a competition, done by an unbelievable Danish architect called Jørgen Utzon, U-T-Z-O-N, Jørgen Utzon. And going there, I think it was just absolutely gorgeous. It's been ridiculed for external shapes, but those are the halls, and actually the interiors and the acoustical property of interiors. I compare it with the Museum of Frank Gehry. I'm a little bit cynical about the Museum of Frank Gehry, which is do it as you will. This building, the interior and the structure was just beautifully done. It was very difficult to build. It was built by, again, Arup, the greatest engineer, probably the greatest structural engineer, the British firm. It's a great building. I thought, because of the site, it's sitting right out in the bay. Because of the site, it doesn't feel brutal at all. And because of the way he's broken up the mass, what we call the masses, or massing, because of the way he's broken up the massing, I think it's also much more scaled, so to speak. By the way, there are buildings that are done in Beton Brut that are not brutal. For example, the CERT building in Harvard Square, if you know the Harvard Health Center, it's called. If you look at it, it's got delicacy in the way, it's got fins on the window section. Somehow the scale is quite acceptable. The idea of having another urban street running right through the building is something wonderful. So there are good and bad, I think.
Boston City Hall is a different site. Boston City Hall, you look at it, it's not very attractive.
Yeah. I don't remember who did the building on the other side of the street. The building on the other side of the street was also done by a very good architect, but he made a background for the building. He tried to create a situation in which that building would stand out, from a colleague to colleague, so to speak. I don't know, I still think it's a great building. It's damned hard to do, that kind of thing. That they got to build it was incredibly... Coleman was just a theoretician. McKinnell did all the work. McKinnell was a talented architect. And it's very much, if you look at it, it's very much like another building of Le Corbusier. So, but there's a